let's move forward now. Objectives and risk and opportunity. Now, I reversed the order of this. I'm going to deal with objectives first. The standard just says you need to set your objectives and plan to achieve them, which sounds easy, but it can be quite tricky. Here's a model I use. I've rearranged this a little bit, but for some reason, a lot of our clients have felt that this works for them in the way this is written. Um, but it may not work for you. So feel free to just listen to this and maybe evolve your own model as you like. This is a top-down model for security objectives. It is a business orientation of it. It is not a bottom-up or an IT or InfoSec set of objectives. So I need to set some goals. They should support and enable my business objectives being met. Yeah. Uh, so here is the high level, really generic objectives for your ISMS. In fact, for 30 or 40 that we've implemented have used roughly the same model. Help meet clients' security expectations. In other words, deliver services to them that has security embedded in it. Support business performance. The business needs to perform optimally so as not to incur massive amounts of costs and losses. And if you look at these two, they're basically performance objectives. As I said, this is governors, leadership teams, accountability. Meet conformance expectations. So we now got performance and conformance. And last, support the development of a motivated and committed staff, a kind of culture aspect. That people can understand their role in this and where they contribute to these outcomes and motivating them to perform. This last one is to perform effectively. This last one I always felt was really not essential, but as I've evolved this and we've used this more often, it's become kind of really powerful for a lot of our clients. Um, Here are those words that I use: service, performance, conformance, culture. Here is the words roughly in those slides before. And here's how I would then break that down. And you could break it down further and further so that I now have detailed objectives that I want to meet. Here's my goal. Here is some, or objective. Here is now the detail. Where does security controls help us meet stakeholders' expectations? Well, when they align with their expectations. So how do I make sure that the way we build the systems is in line with those things? That's requirements definition, ideation. It may be a whole raft of other things, which we might see as we go along. But without me reading through all these, here's a model that you might use to explore your own business, agency, organization's goals. You might not want to use these words. Feel free to change them. I do have a research client that's kind of quasi-government here in Sydney, where these words were aligned to the way they do business. The research firm, for example, and I'm just trying to remember it now, acquired data from large repositories. They took that data and ingested into warehouses, if you like, petabytes, zettabytes. I'm not sure how many bytes there were, but it was in the very large category. Um, and so they had a bunch of, requirements about what data would they collect and what data would they not collect. Ethically, it presented problems. Security-wise, it might present problems, or compliance-wise, it might present problems. So they had a process of validating ingested data. And so that's what I captured. Then they had a process of configuring the research people, the universities, the professors, and the other was in health industry researchers, provisioning them. What do they get? What suite of tools do they get? And then lastly, how do we make sure that the systems were up and available, because you don't want to run a multi-day query over, huge repository of data that fails partway through. So how do they build resilience and recoverability? That was essentially the three that I used for them, and they quite liked that. What was interesting with my model, just as one slight tangent on that, was because the model was specific for their organization but generic enough for them, they realized that their architecture and deployment meant that they could move from health-related data research to any other industry because they had a repeatable business process now. So that actually opened an investment opportunity for them as a business, which they'd never seen before until we looked at it in this kind of model. All right, the last little bit here, and apologies ahead of time for the ugly slide, but I just threw down here planning and how to achieve them. It's essentially take those objectives and work out what will be done, what resources, who, you kind of just want to put a who, what, when, where, why, and how to this, and then work it out. Because this is going to guide your implementation planning in the next phase. This could be light on because in fact, you might want to come back kind of like a Mr. Squiggle diagram for those of you that are as old as me. You might want to come back and paint some of these out once you've got some more knowledge down through your ISMS. Come back and say, oh, okay, when we do that, that'll help us right here. So this might be a little bit of a blank page, but it may be something you can start to paint as you go along. All right, now, so that's objectives and how to achieve them. If we step back up in the standard to 6.1, it now asks us to define a process to achieve those outcomes. Okay, we need to ensure we achieve those outcomes through a process for managing risk and opportunity. Now, this is in planning. In the standard, and it's a little confusing the way the standard, I think, does this, but in the standard, we're required at 6 to define our risk methodology. At clause 8, we implement it. Plan, do, check, act kind of cycle. We're in the plan. Plan for how will we identify risks and opportunities and how will we treat them. In other words, here you get to things like defining risk appetite, defining likelihood and consequence or impact, and all of that stuff. So let's have a look at this. My model has always been start from the top. We know what stakeholders' expectations are. I've beaten you up about it already. We've set security objectives and principles, probably in our policy framework, but in our discussions with the leadership team and looking at our scope, what are we trying to achieve? I've got some examples. If the stakeholders expect service excellence, for example, an objective might be IT system service reliability. If our stakeholders expect, I don't know, compliance or privacy or something like that, then security and privacy of the data set about them would probably be a reasonably good objective. So these expectations drive our objectives, our policies, and our principles, but these things are hampered by risks. In other words, the risks would lead us to not achieve these outcomes and these outcomes. So following that, service loss, privacy breach are the opposites of that. These present us with opportunities. These present us with risks. These risks require us to put in place capabilities and controls. Now, I like the word capabilities. I was going to put my capability diagram in here, but I'll probably get on a tangent and talk for half an hour, and I don't have the time. Maybe in our round 2, we might look at capability frameworks and capability models. But essentially, what is it we need to do well? Remember my question. We'll get there in a moment. I haven't done my question yet. So here's the model of this process. Lastly, if you look at the loop back, my capabilities and controls, the things we must do well, help us or help enable the achievement of the goals and objectives that meet our stakeholders' needs. These are the things that we need to monitor, measure, and do well if they directly relate to these outcomes. So this is the risk and opportunity logic in the standard that's not very clear. And you'll even find ISO 27005 only deals with risk and it deals with it from a threat model. ISO 31000 calls out opportunities but gives no guidance. COBIT for risk has this logic in it, but I'm representing it in a different construct here. It has a very similar, almost the same model. And a diagram I've got in a little while is essentially COBIT 5 for risk. In fact, it came out in 2009, the model that I'm going to show. So there's this thing, you'll notice my word here, the cascade. What is your goals and risk cascade? And what are your capabilities and controls that are essential for you to help meet these objectives. If you do anything in your ISMS, try and work through this logic a little bit to find out how that can be done. I know from a cyber perspective, you're probably attacking this slightly differently. What are the threats that our stakeholders would expect we're aware of? How will we manage those threats against the assets that they might compromise? What are those risks now? And what are our capabilities and controls that manage our cybersecurity responsibilities? It's the same kind of logic, and it works, in those two directions. Here's ISO 31000. You may already be familiar. It basically has this walkthrough with the bars on either side. Understand your business, clause 4, again, keeps coming up. Identify risks, analyze them, and evaluate is in the standard called risk assessment. There is no real good lexicon or agreed definition of these terms. And I do see sometimes risk models that say risk assessment, but they mean risk analysis. So I wouldn't worry too much about the specifics of the words here, but this is the model that I use, the 31,000. So identify the risks in your context, analyze them for likelihood and consequence, evaluate the current control environment, and determine, is that acceptable or do I need to treat it more? Monitor that process and review it. And these arrows could mean do this at any point in time in this logic, and communicate and consult with the people that matter. Your leadership, the risk owners, your stakeholders. Who are these people that you could engage in these discussions? That's 31,000, perfectly good model. But there's the only downside of it is it doesn't really give guidance on the opportunity side. All right, here's that from a slightly different lens. Performing risk identification, we might identify strategic management and IT and ops risks. So you might want to layer your risk identification process. And that's helpful because these risks have different owners, and establishing, remember, role and responsibility, establishing risk ownership is really fundamental. You do not want to have the CISO, and actually this is my theory. It's not universally agreed, so I'm going to lay it out there and take any flack. But I don't believe that CISO should take information security risk ownership. I think information security risk ownership lies in the business that needs that information because it is a cost of goods sold. Security controls within their line of business is their budget item. And that is not how we've done it. And that is largely why business sees that IT or InfoSec owns these risks, because they're not budgeting for it. They're not calculating the cost of, and in my IIA, Institute of Internal Auditors session a month or two ago, I coined a phrase for them, cost of secure goods sold. If I have a business unit that doesn't know how much money they invest to secure their product or service, they don't actually know their cost of goods sold, and it's false accounting. And so this identification practice, I think, is really critical here. Who owns the risk? Who owns IT related risk? Who owns security risk? Anyway, analyze impact and control, evaluate residual risk, treat it with plans, monitor it. So that's essentially the model for 31,000. Now, let me talk about something slightly tricky here. This is kind of an advanced thinking process here on that prior model. We've all done the risk method where we identify negative risk scenarios. We might lose. So actually, I'll just switch to my typical three. There's pretty much three root risks in information security: loss, damage, and disclosure. Loss of an asset, loss of a system, loss of people, loss of a building. Damage to, so misconfiguration, loss of integrity, any of those things. And disclosure, breach, exposure of sensitive material. They are the opposite of confidentiality, integrity, availability. So the model basically is that we would identify risks that present themselves as loss, damage, or disclosure scenarios. And that's what we see almost universally in risk registers, the negative risk scenarios that we need to mitigate, transfer, avoid, or accept. Now, managing negative risks is essential. This is essentially the cybersecurity proposition here. And so we have to do this. But we can also manage what you might call positive risks or opportunities. And this is the positive outcomes or opportunities side. And we do this through investment in change. And I'm just going to call up my additional questions here. To answer the what are the scenarios, we just simply answer the question, what must we do well to succeed? Remember my cascade? What business processes must function well? What control activities must function well? What security activities must function well for us to meet that stakeholder expectation? Whether that stakeholder is a shareholder in a public company, whether they're a citizen who's expecting, their child to go through school, or whether they're a patient in a hospital or an investor in the state in terms of public-private infrastructure. What must we do well for that to succeed allows us to look at risks in a positive lens and say, well, let's enhance the way we do this process. Let's improve the processes and the controls here. Maybe we've got a practice of it that we could exploit that would allow us to do things in a better or different way. Maybe we could innovate. We've got, some neat practice already. Maybe if we modify and put new features there, we could do better with our customer service. And the what can go wrong. Now, the reason I write these questions is, and these questions flow really neatly here, the what can go wrong red triangle is infinite. The bottom-up scenarios are infinite. And we could do risk identification based on an infinite evolving list of things that could possibly go wrong. But we might never find the key risk scenario for us unless we know our context. And you'll notice here the typical risk register uses this bottom-up approach, the risks based on negative scenarios, asset, threat, vulnerability, logic, threat-based scenarios, asset-based, loss, damage, disclosure-based. But a counter way to do it is to start at the top down, that context. If I know what I'm trying to achieve, remember my cascade. If I know what my objectives are, remember my performance and conformance goals. If I know what these are and I write them in positive and then negative language, then I can now define a finite number of key risk scenarios in any of these bottom-up scenarios. So I can now, by knowing the top-down opportunities we're trying to achieve, reverse engineer those to risks to those opportunities, and then deconstruct those top-down risks. I will get a finite list of bottom-up scenarios. Now that is a far more manageable, far more pragmatic, and a far more engaging discussion with your leadership than a random set of infinite what can go wrong. And I know you do need to do the likelihood and consequence stuff, and that filters this list, bottom-up scenario list down. But in many ways, a bottom-up only approach is almost universally disconnected from goals and outcomes. They are just looking at threat and asset loss, not the implications of those on achieving what we're here for. So that's why I don't use a bottom-up only. It's why I've always done this top-down. I use this top-down model when I was in CommBank in their program, core banking program, and we achieved much better program and project outcomes by applying the logic of both of this. And I've seen and I've done in my way distant past the bottom-up, and felt like that disconnect with my leadership, because I'm saying, kind of the what if this went wrong, what if that went wrong. And if anyone's ever read the story about Chicken Little, that is exactly what this model can look like at times. The doomsday scenario, my doomsday prepper. So think about that model. I know, and you might remember at the beginning of this, I said this is slightly more advanced than your ISO 31000 typical risk learning. So if that didn't make much sense, don't worry too much, but just do at least stick with some way to do a bottom-up scenarios, the process, threat, asset, system-based scenarios that are meaningful, that relate to goals or outcomes. If you look down here, you'll see this is very much like our PARI one pager. Processes, assets, systems, threats, interested parties. Okay, so that PARI does help me with bottom up, but the PARI has at the top left service outcomes, service goals, process goals. What are we trying to achieve and why? So the PARI is really insightful for this, along with lots of other things. Now, I might just hold there, and Tristan, if was there any questions on that, but if anyone has a question, feel free to ask, because that's a little bit more advanced than most people are probably expected to do. If none, I'll move on.
No questions.
Okay. Now, just to finish on this, the reason I like this is because, and if you remember that comment I made about the difficulty in engaging with your leadership, if you imagine going to your leadership, you're going to table your cybersecurity status report and your risk report to the executives, and you're presenting to them the what can go wrong scenarios. Threat actors might steal this, someone might steal that, this system could get denial of service attack. And they go, yeah, but how does that affect us, like as a business? Is that going to affect our customers? That's just like the obvious question they're going to ask. And so this model overcomes that. You can connect these to an outcome. You know, those threat actors might compromise that system. And if that system is compromised, we will not be able to deliver this service to these customers, or we'll do it at a much degraded way, or it'll cost us time and money, or we'll be non-compliant, and that's an issue. And the ability to connect these goals and outcomes to these scenarios is just gold at your leadership discussion. It shows you're thinking about them. All right, moving along. You need to, as part of the standard, and I won't dwell on this because it's possibly something that other people will do for you in your business. You need to develop risk criteria. These are in two ways. Firstly, the risk criteria for acceptance of risk. Who can accept what risk? By level, high, medium, low, or by type, compliance risk, operational risk, customer facing, service risk, whatever you want to call it. In other words, who's going to craft a risk appetite statement for you? I prefer this not to be done by security folk, because this is about business defining what they want, what their appetite for risk is, what their capacity for risk is, and what they are willing to say yes or no to. In many ISMSs, this gets done from security. That's kind of just the way stuff happens. I know I wrote the risk model for education department many years ago, and I don't know where it ever got to, but you know, security often is the initiator of some of this stuff. Risk acceptance criteria might be derived. You might create a matrix and just go with that. That's probably primitive. And it defines what to do with risk based on rating and responsibility. If you have a risk that's rated high and it's compliance, who has to do what? That kind of thing. You also need, in the second criteria, is the criteria to perform the assessment, the likelihood and consequence criteria, the risk level. You need the criteria for performing these systematically. In other words, how often, in what way, how will we identify risks? I just showed you some methods. We'll use a top-down and bottom-up approach. We'll use ISO 27005 risk and threat lists. What is it that is systematic? Systematic gives you repeatable. Repeatable gives you consistent data. That gives you the ability to analyze risks over time. Without a systematic model, it's just finger in the air guesswork. I didn't write on here, and I don't have any more on it, but you might want to look at models like FAIR, the Factor Analysis for Information Risk, and maybe there are others out there that help you quantify risk a little bit better than what I'm about to show you. but I'll talk about that in a moment too. Your risk criteria must be documented in a risk methodology. Risk appetite might be in a RAS. So these two sets of criteria need to be documented somewhere or other. Now, I did mention, hopefully this is developed by an enterprise risk management group, team, person, the audit and risk committee, if you have one. This is something really good to outsource to somebody else if you can. If you can't, you might have to invent it yourself. Here's some really rough, simple, I guess, a better word, basic models for impact. And I'm not going to go through it. You make up your own words, you make up your own scale. Here's a more detailed model using some categories of impact: financial, operational, contractual, satisfaction. You might want to add work health safety. You might already have one. I deliberately put reputation on the very edge here because I don't want my risk assessors to read this. The reason for that is probably another one of my hobby horses, one of my gripes and concerns, is that I've often read risks that say things like, breach of private data would lead to reputation damage. Yeah, not immediately. Not immediately. It would immediately lead to probably operational or contractual or regulatory issues. So rate this first. It's probably going to upset some people. So rate these first. And then once you've worked out these things, you can now say, how will that affect our reputation? But it almost never, there's only maybe one or two circumstances where reputation occurs, reputation damage occurs before one of these 4 or 5 or whatever you have in here. So I really dislike seeing risks that say this event caused reputation damage. It just suggests you haven't thought through the actual impact, rolling impact of that event on your business. Because, and here's the real reason that I don't like it, you can't put control in for reputation, but I can put controls in for all these other things. So I want to know what I can control, not what I can't. This comes from trust. This comes from good control over here. If I can control how well we manage customer service, I can contain this problem. If I don't, yeah, I'm going to get reputation damage and I deserve it. Here's a likelihood table. You probably need to be a bit more detailed than this, but this is a simple model just for you to work from. There are plenty of examples out there if you just look around. Probabilities may be defined in different ways to better reflect your risk scenarios. Frequency might be a model you use. We sometimes see it as I was thinking of another term, but I can't quite. So probability and frequency, how often is it likely to occur? Now, the FAIR model picks this up a little bit and tries to put a bit more quantifiable data to both likelihood and consequence. And that's great, but my only criticism, and look, FAIR's a very, very important model, but it is still based on the notion that what went on in the past is a predictor for what will happen tomorrow. And I don't necessarily buy that. So we could use the FAIR model to give us a current state of what the quantifiable likelihood and consequences are for a threat vulnerability pair on an asset, but it might be completely different tomorrow when it actually happens. And so we should take these things with some grain of salt. Now, I've talked a little bit about that. I haven't, obviously no one here from FAIR to argue against that, and I'm sure there's great debate on whether I'm right or wrong there. So I could be off the mark, but I do believe that risk management inherently is subjective, no matter how we try and quantify it. And so I'd add this last comment here. Try to get data. We're going to look at clause 9.1, metrics and measures. Use that data to help you quantify likelihood and consequence, because you've got incident records as you start to create your ISMS. You've got metrics and measures on errors, on problems, on customer complaints, on user provisioning, on positive controls. Use those to determine likelihood and consequence. Initially, you probably start reasonably subjective, and over time, as you get data, you can get more quantifiable and therefore more objective. The last couple of slides here is around risk appetite. You should have a good awareness of what risk appetite is, because from a cyber perspective, somehow or other, you've got to try and define it. I've had a go at this with a couple of companies, private sector, and it was quite difficult to get the leadership to say anything other than none, no cyber events, but that's not practical. So what's a practical / acceptable amount of potential loss? If I look at the last sentence, what is the amount of loss we're willing to accept to achieve whatever we're trying to do with our money? We've got a limited budget. We can't block all threat actors. We can't prevent all likely problems with our IT, our systems, our information assets, our user base. So where can we say that would be bad? And that's like, yeah, it's that we don't want it to happen, but we could probably tolerate some amount of that. This is a hard discussion with leadership. So appetite, the amount of risk at a general level that an organization is willing to accept to achieve its objectives. How many errors, how many failings, how many incidents are acceptable? Now, you can use continual improvement to drive those problem scenarios down, and that means that you're getting better at managing risk. So the organization's capacity to absorb loss, you don't have unlimited money. Reputation damage, yeah, look, that's going to eventuate at some point. How predisposed is management towards taking risk? Is it cautious or aggressive? Do we want to be innovative? Do we want to take organizational change activities, as far as we can to improve our business, or not? Because if you're not willing to innovate and make change, then you are stuck with legacy and whatever the current behavior model is. So this is where perhaps your intentional culture comes in. What kind of risk taking is acceptable for us? And how can we build a culture that takes the right risks at the right time, conscious of the amount of loss that may be incurred if we go down that path? That's really complex, I think, discussion. The last thing here is roughly just trying to put some kind of mapping to this. Anything in this green space of low likelihood, low impact, or high impact but pretty unlikely, and the opposite down here, is an opportunity. Now I'm going to use this word, an opportunity for us to take more risk. Okay, risks that are here acceptable, probably. Risks here probably unacceptable. This stuff, the red zone, probably don't want that to happen at all. So if you're rating risks and they come up, if you think back to this model, if you're rating risks and this is the current state, then you got an issue of urgency probably. If they're rating in here, you probably are still going to aim to move them down. If you've got risks in this moderate space, you're probably still aiming to bring them down. But if you've got risks down here in the green space, especially risks down here, man, you want to cut those controls and probably take a bit more risk, because this is costing you for no return, maybe. Notice I said maybe. An example here is where you want to eliminate the excessive volume of or frequency of a control that is keeping the risk at the lowest possible level. User access reviews is an example here that I talk about a little bit, and that is where in user access review, we might do quarterly review of who has access to a whole raft of systems. And if after a year of doing this, we're not finding any errors, then probably you could take that instead of quarterly to 6 monthly. But if you see an error, you might drop it back. But what is the error? You need to evaluate what would be the error and what would be the impact of the error. And if that's terrible, if one error goes to extreme, then yeah, leave it at quarter, or maybe you're not doing it often enough. But with all of those controls, the idea here is to try to free up available resources to do the things that matter and to fix things that matter. If you're spending a lot on controls that are low likelihood, low impact risks, then those controls probably need to be rethought. Any questions on risk method? Andrew, yeah, sure.
Having worked in fraud and the risk sector previously, every department or section has its own understanding or metric of what a risk metric is. How do you make it uniform across?
Yeah, that's an ouch, isn't it? Yeah, look, for every organization, you need one risk method, one risk model. Um, I've seen organizations try to take multiple models and distill them into one meaningful model. That's ultimately the answer to your question. How to do that and not sort of, have dissatisfied people because they think their model is better, is probably something that's best left to the leadership to negotiate that, I think. Maybe engaging risk practitioners, an expert from, I don't know, Risk Management Institute or somebody who does these things that can negotiate through the right model. While I've done a lot of this work, I wouldn't say that I could kind of pick up all risks from all avenues like credit risk, finance risk, market risk. That's not my expertise. So if it does contain any of that in there, then somehow you need to sort of smush it all together to get one enterprise approach. That it is a challenge. I don't know how easily you do it, but I do think you probably just need to escalate it and get leadership to start to work through how do they want to solve that problem. The short term, I guess, for your ISMS is to either, pick a winner, pick a model, one of the ones that the business has, and see if you can use it. And if it presents problems, I caution against inventing a new one, but you might want to just raise that then, just put it on the table and say, look, if we do this, we can't do this. This model doesn't allow me to do this. So the question, I guess, the answer to that is, what add-on, and this is where 27005 does provide value. If I have an enterprise risk management method and it doesn't help me in the security space, what add-on from a security lens can I put into it that helps anyone out there doing InfoSec risk assessment, risk management, that continues to apply the broader model, but has that lens to it that we need as well. That's not easy to do, but it's doable. You could define, for example, ways that you want to do it in security. If the root cause of the problem is a different impact likelihood table, then that's just got to be sorted out at the top. That's just going to go nowhere because you'll have people rating risks that are different, apples and oranges kind of scenario, and that doesn't help investment.
Yeah, we've found that to be one of our biggest bugbears when trying to do different divisions within an agency and everybody has their own lens.
Yeah, so lenses are okay. The model ought to be uniform, and the model really just ought to be something like a walkthrough of this ISO 31000. And the lenses might be, how do we assess information security related risk using the same matrices, the same likelihood and consequence table? And the tooling in here for identification for InfoSec might be my PARI, as I showed you, the top down, but they might have a completely different model for this part. The analysis, which we'll look at as we move into the next bit, is probably going to need to be probably universal, but there could be some independent pieces, like, you might have some InfoSec analysis. Think about threat intelligence would be an input to the analysis that they wouldn't have threat intelligence in, I don't know, finance risk. That's just not a part of that process. So you might have some components that you want to build specifically to suit your InfoSec lens that the rest of the business doesn't really need unless they're doing InfoSec risk assessment. But when you get to treatment down the bottom here, this is where you want to be making decisions on treatment based on an evaluation, based on a universal picture of what the likelihoods and consequences are rating as. Because, you know, if you say, if you're accepting risk that is different level of risk than what somebody else is treating for, then you might have a bit of an issue. But you could do categorization of appetite. You know, in other words, let me explain that. InfoSec or cybersec risk, you might want to treat down to low, but financial or investment risk might be moderate or high. In other words, we're willing to spend money on product development, digitization, ideation, and all of that, but we're not willing to lose money through cyber. You know, so they would be different appetites, and that's fine. But it's the same model we're using, the same rating scheme. So, Steve, I think that's probably where you might attack it. So, standardize the framework for calculating risk and acceptance, but modify the tooling that gets used to help us get to a state where we've determined level of risk. How about that?
Sweet. Thank you.